I'm reading from a piece that was in an American newspaper, a journalist called William Theodore Peters, who wrote a piece called Oscar Wilde at Home, and it was published in 1894. He'd obviously been to Tite Street. Mr. Oscar Wilde has a most attractive home at number 16 Tite Street, and it was there that his charming wife presented him to me. Mrs. Wilde receives during the season on Wednesday afternoons in a drawing room decorated in white and harmonising shades of blue and green. If one has the privilege of being admitted to it, the interior of number 16 Tite Street is well worthy of inspection, for apart from its aesthetic beauty, it contains many interesting literary and artistic souvenirs. In Mr. Wilde's study, which is littered with books, pamphlets and manuscripts, a place for everything and nothing in its place, a veritable paradise for a man of letters, I remarked hanging upon the wall the original manuscript of Keats' Blue Sonnet, and looking calmly down from its pedestal, beautiful and forever young, a life-size bust of the Hermes of Praxiteles. Nearby on a chair stood a clever imitation of an old Egyptian painting by Mr. Charles Ricketts, a portrait of the incomparable Mr. W.H. And leaning against a wall on the floor was a nude study of a woman by Mr. Charles Shannon. "What does Cook think?" asked Mr. Wilde with a twinkle in his eye. In the drawing room is a full-length portrait of the author of Lady Windermere's Fan by Mr. Harper Pennington, an etching by Whistler, and good reproduction of Bastien Lepage's portrait of Bernhardt, underneath which is a note in uncertain English by the Divine One to Mr. Wilde. Here is also to be seen a portrait of Lady Mount Temple and a graceful drawing by Mr. Graham Robertson of Miss Ellen Terry. The room is filled but not overcrowded with bibelots, silver photograph frames, flowers, rare first editions, pretty lamps, silken cushions, all the usual adjuncts of a smart London drawing room. Mrs. Wilde sits on a low couch by the fire, pouring out tea from an old Georgian teapot with a malachite green handle. Cyril, the elder of her two sons, a fine little boy, is aiding his mother in dispensing hospitality to her guests. Mrs. Wilde, who is one of the London beauties, has a blooming complexion and an abundance of gold brown hair. She's always tastefully and modishly dressed. On the first night of Lady Windermere's Fan, she made a very attractive picture in one of the stage boxes, wearing a blue silk gown copied from the style of dress worn by Henrietta Maria in Van Dyck's portrait. It's easy to be seen that among Mr. Wilde's most ardent admirers, not the least is his wife, whose devotion is indeed charming. She's made a complete collection of his journalistic work in a large scrapbook, in which I noticed an appreciative review of one of Mr. Richard Le Gallienne's earlier books and an article on Mrs. Brown Potter and Buffalo Bill's first season in London. Mr. Wilde hates journalistic work, says Mrs. Wilde. I was likewise permitted to turn the leaves of a very interesting book of autographs, which contains specimens of the writings of almost every living famous English author, artist, statesman, actor and actress, most of whom Mrs. Wilde has known personally. Among these I observed the sentiments in prose or verse of Mr. Henry Irving, Miss Ellen Terry, Mr. Burne-Jones, Mr. George Meredith, Mr. Ruskin, Mr. Archibald Balfour and Miss Marie Corelli. Late in the afternoon, but before his wife's guests had departed, a step is heard on the stair. The portiere is pushed aside by a large, smooth white hand, and Mr. Oscar Wilde, in a fashionable frock coat and irreproachable trousers, his silk scarf fastened with the very latest style of pin, wearing a carefully thought-out buttonhole and carrying a pair of spotless gloves, enters his wife's drawing room smiling.